Good morning. I want to reiterate Dr. Donaldson's comment. This is an amazing turnout. Thank you all. As Associate Dean and on behalf of Dean Rainford and our NCSSS faculty, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our teach-in on anti-racism. As we begin our time together this morning, I'm very mindful that members of our community cannot be with us. They are celebrating Rosh Hashanah, one of the high holy days in their Jewish faith. As we have communicated before, we deeply regret this conflict. As social workers, we know the importance of inclusion. Students who were unable to be here this morning will have access to readings and to videos from this morning's program and also this afternoon's program with Bishop Braxton. The videotape will be available on our website through YouTube. In addition, Dean Rainford, our NCSSS faculty, and the Office of Campus Ministry will be scheduling a meeting to discuss inclusivity here at NCSSS. Finally, today's program is just the beginning of a series of events sponsored by NCSSS's Intercultural Working Group, headed by Dr. N. Coe, who will address marginalization, discrimination, and racism. And we look forward to all of you participating. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Sister Ruth Harkin, who is the Associate Director of Campus Ministry for Graduate and Professional Studies. Sister Ruth is going to lead us in a reflection. Sister Ruth?
Thank you, Marie, and welcome also to everyone. I think this is a very high, holy moment in the history of Catholic University and in the history of this day. And we do recognize that this is indeed a very high moment for our Jewish brothers and sisters as they celebrate Rosh Hashanah, which for them it really is the head of the new year. It is their Jewish New Year, in which they commemorate not only God's creation of the world, but also the day of judgment, when God remembers and is depicted as a merciful judge who understands the frail nature of human beings. For in the words of Micah, he will take us back in love, he will cover up our iniquities, he will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. And so as we gather this day, we certainly recognize the sin that we have of racism in the United States. And we pray with our holy brothers and sisters who are Jewish that too our hearts and minds may be transformed and changed so that we too may be more inclusive and more loving. And so let us enter the presence of our God and begin as we begin all things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus Christ, who reached across the ethnic boundaries between Samaritan, Roman, and Jew, who offered fresh sight to the blind and freedom to captives, help us to break down the barriers in our community. So many men, women, and children have been hurt by the sin of racism. Enable us to see the reality of racism and bigotry, and free us to challenge and uproot it from ourselves, our society, and our world. Help us to join our hands and hearts together so we may be open to your grace to become the balm in Gilead. And so this day and always, may we join our hands, our hearts, and our voices as we work together to bring healing, hope, love, and justice for all. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Okay. Thank you, Sister Ruth. Thank you, Dr. Raber. And thanks to all of you, but most importantly, at this moment, thank you to these incredible panelists that we have. We have really assembled some of the best anti-racist organizers in DC. Really, some of the best anti-racist organizers. So it is a great and humbling privilege for me to help to facilitate this conversation. Let me tell you how it's going to work. In a moment, I'm going to introduce each one briefly so you know who they are and where they're coming from. And then I will invite each speaker up when it's their turn to speak, and then I will read you their full bios. Because if I read all the full bios, you'd all be like, oh, you know, and you wouldn't remember. By the time we got to Indira, you'd forget, right? So that's kind of how it's going to work. We've got 2 hours for this panel, 2.5 hours for this panel. This is fantastic, right? This is great to have this much time for a panel discussion. So as a consequence, after each person speaks, I will allow for one burning question, just one burning question, because you would probably be able to spend hours with each person individually. And then I'll move it on to the next person, one burning question, the next and the next, okay? And then at the end, we'll open it up, and you can follow up from what you heard. You don't have to even ask a question, but that's kind of the way it's going to work. We're not going to hold all questions to the very end because, things are going to be emerging for you. Does that sound all right? Okay, that's great. Okay, so let me just tell you who we've got here. We've got Sister Patti Chappell from Pax Christi. In Pax Christi, you might know them as a peace organization, anti-nuclear arms, anti-war, but they also do anti-racism work. So Sister Patti is the head of that in DC, and is engaged in all of those things. In fact, she came to my Catholic parish and did an anti-racism training for our parish community and was phenomenal. Then we have Aja Taylor. Now, Aja's the advocacy director at Bread for the City. And a prayer that I might add to what Sister Ruth offered is, and this is really important for social workers, God, let us not be complicit. Let us not be complicit. And Aja's going to talk about racism within nonprofit social service organizations. And let me tell you, this is a problem. This is a problem, and we don't realize it. And social workers face these ethical dilemmas about duty to organization and duty to people we serve. So let us not be complicit in our organizations for perpetuating racism. So that's what Aja's going to talk about. I forgot to say, Sister Patty's going to talk about structural racism over history to contemporary times. That's a big talk in 15, 20 minutes. And then we have Eleanor Hancock. You might remember Eleanor Hancock. She came and spoke, was a member of the social work kickoff event we had in the spring. And I met her through Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, but she's also the executive director of White Awake. So this is a white allies organization that brings together contemplative practices, spiritual practices with anti-racism work. And that's a very important element. Otherwise, we bring violence and hatred into our anti-racism work. We see that. So Eleanor will talk about how to be a white ally. And then Indira Hennard. Indira, one of our grads, Sister Patty's one of our grads, but Indira is the head of the DC Rape Crisis Center and is an international speaker on gender violence issues. And she will be speaking about being a black ally, right? Because people make the mistake of talking about racism in binary terms, black versus white. But we know, our current environment is reminding us, right, that it's a much more complex issue than that. So that's who we have on the panel. And I would like to first invite Sister Patti Chappell to come up. And let me give you her background. So she's, again, at Pax Christi. She's born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut, the oldest of 7 children. She's a member of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. She holds a master's degree in social work, as I mentioned, from our school. So proud. She's a licensed social worker in D.C. From 1981 to 1989, she was working in Philadelphia for Shalom Incorporated, doing work in the substance abuse field. Her primary emphasis was providing intervention services to African American youth and their families. She was also employed as a family therapist with the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic and was involved in several professional and religious organizations across the United States. She served as full-time president of the National Black Sisters Conference from 1995 to 2001. And the National Black Sisters Conference, under her leadership, sponsored the first national gathering for Black Catholic women in July 2011. At that time, Sister served on the provincial leadership team of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur in the Connecticut province. She was the first African American to serve in this capacity. In 2011, she became the first African American executive director of Pax Christi USA, the National Catholic Peace and Justice Movement, located here in D.C. Can we offer a warm welcome to Sister Patty?
Thank you. Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Come on, y'all could do better than that. Good morning, my brothers and sisters. It is indeed a pleasure, and I feel very humbled to be able to speak to you, my colleagues, in terms of being social workers, and then also those of you who are discerning and choosing to be social workers. And I just have to say, I am just so excited that NCSSS is trying to break open and deal with the issue of racism and anti-racism. In 1977, when I came up out of here, we certainly were nowhere near trying to even talk about that. And so I'm just grateful to be able to come back to you all and just share a few words. And as my friend here said, I'm supposed to talk about institutional structural racism in 15 minutes. So y'all just bear with me, okay? So what I'm going to do is to basically say, if I asked every single one of us in this room to define racism, we probably would have 100 and some odd different aspects of what it would be, right? Perhaps, correct, maybe? Come on, y'all, wake up. I know it's 9 or whatever time it is, but y'all got to wake up, okay? You got to wake up. So, for the sake of our time together, what I'm going to ask you to do is to basically work with this definition that I work with in our work. So racism is personal racial prejudice plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions. Y'all got that? Personal racial prejudice plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions. Now, when you look at that understanding of racism, the word power is integral in that definition. Now, power can be both positive and negative. Am I right? Those of us who in this room who are social workers or who are aspiring to be social workers, we know that power can be used in a positive manner to enhance the maximum potential of our clients. We also know that power positively can be used to move systems, to change policy, practices, and procedures. So we know that, in fact, there is a positive piece when we're talking about power in and of itself. But we also know that power, there are negative forces that are also connected when we use the word power. For instance, Power oftentimes can connote control over somebody. It can often connote the idea of obeying something or somebody. We also know that power can be negatively used to allow some folk in and keep other folk out. And so that's why when we talk about racism, though, we're talking about the misuse of power by systems and institutions. So racism is just not, my brothers and sisters, it is just not personal racial prejudice. Everybody up in this room, all of us up in here, have some kind of personal racial prejudice. If you say you don't, you're lying, I'm sorry. But the fact of the matter is, racism is more than just that personal racial prejudice. You couple that with the misuse of power by systems and institutions. And when it is coupled with that, therein comes up the systemic and institutional racism that you and I experience. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay, so long as we good there, right? Now, you all know, being social workers, we all learned in Sociology 101 about systems, right? We know that there are 7 social systems that have socialized those of us who were born and raised in the United States, correct? We know about the family. Is not the family the primary social system? We know about the educational system. We know about the legal system. We know about the economic system. We know about the social system. And we know about the system, the church is also, religious church is also a social system, correct? And every single one of those systems that we have grown up in the United States have impacted us and have helped socialize us into learning how to act, how to respond, how to interface, not only with each other as individuals, but also how we interact with organizations, governments, and systems that exist, right? And what I am saying to you is that historically, the historical reality for those of us who have been raised in the U.S., all systems, keep in mind those systems that I have mentioned, all systems in the U.S. were created to maintain power and control in the hands initially of white males. And then in 1920, when white women won the right to vote, white women flipped right into that as well. If you can't say amen, say ouch. Say ouch, it's all right. And so what I am suggesting is that every system in the United States certainly never had, did not intend to be protective of people of color. Now, if I had time, which I don't, I would show you how I would give you an overview, how institutional and systemic racism, how it got embedded in these systems through enactment of laws, policies, procedures, and practices. Y'all with me so far? Yes. I can give you just a glimpse of what some of those laws are, starting with the papal bulls. The papal bulls. Go back and check it out. Read about the papal bulls. I ain't got time to go all into the papal bulls, but you all go ahead and look it up. We know about the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery, which impacted many things. We know about slavery. We know about the Indian Removal Act. We know about the Black Codes, which were implemented after emancipation. We know about the Japanese American Internment Act, the GI Bill of 1944, the Voter Registration Act, Stand Your Ground, and it goes on and on and on. But the fact of the matter is, many of the laws that have been put in place in this country have been put in place purposely to maintain white supremacy, white power, and privilege. And we as social workers, that's deep, y'all. That's deep. Because as change agents, then it becomes our moral responsibility to work towards the transformation and the eradication of systems and institutions that do not guarantee equal protection of everyone under the law. It is our right and our responsibility to work towards dismantling systems which do not empower people to be self-determined, which do not guarantee people the right and the responsibility to be perceived as human beings with equal rights and equal privileges. Every single individual, we as social workers know, we are to work towards the maximum human potential for every single one of our clients. And what I am suggesting to you is that most of our laws in this country were set up systemically to not empower people of color. Y'all got that? And that's why I keep my little bumper sticker with me wherever I go. It's on the back of my car. Racism, our national disease. Getting sick was not our fault. Getting well is our responsibility. Because once you know the history of how these laws and policies and practices and procedures have come in place, as a social worker, it is your ethical and moral responsibility to work against that. And if you are not going to do that, do me a favor. Don't become social workers. Because we're talking about systemic change. I remember when I was here, I don't know what they call it now, but we had micro and macro and all of those kind of things. And I wanted to be a community organizer. Okay, that was, I wanted to change shit. Excuse my expression, but I wanted to change shit. And so, you know, I was like, okay, I can do individual social work, I can do group work, but I really was interested in the organizing piece. But at that time, you also have to understand, people weren't going to hire you to help change systems. Y'all follow what I'm saying? People weren't going to hire me to say, now I'm going to come in here and this is what's messed up with your system, and I'm going to help you. I want you to pay me, okay? Thank you. To help bring about transformation. But that is what we are called to do. And what I have learned over the years in my social work profession is how to combine all that I learned, individual, group, community organizing. And I can stand before you today and say it was because of Catholic University going through this school over here, NCSSS, that I'm able to use those skills to this day. 1 minute. Okay, let's take a look at the 3 current issues that clearly reflect systemic and institutional racism within the U.S. Healthcare. There's an ongoing attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act, disparagingly known as Obamacare. But what we do know about the Affordable Care Act is that it provides coverage for every person in need: children, elderly, poor, disabled, those with pre-existing conditions, and women. Although not perfect, it does guarantee the right for all to receive adequate coverage. Don't get twisted in wanting to support the Graham-Cassidy bill, which is being pushed right now by Congress. This bill would cut Medicaid, it would cut services to children, and place the burden of coverage on the states. This bill will take away the safety net that provides health services for people without insurance. The health of America's most vulnerable people, primarily black and brown, would be in jeopardy. Secondly, immigration. The current immigration in this country is clearly focused on deporting and removing women, children, and men who, when you look at it, they are folks who are from communities of color, my brothers and sisters. What Congress needs, we need a bipartisan, comprehensive bill that protects these brothers and sisters and ensures a just path to citizenship. The third issue, the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration on both the federal, state, and prison and private prisons. We know in looking at the statistics that there are a disproportionate number of people of color incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, for which their white counterparts oftentimes go free. And some of those reasons are because those reasons exist because for many of these brothers and sisters, they do not have access to legal counsel. There is an inability on their part to afford legal counsel. And there is a bias which continues to be demonstrated that a person of color is assumed to be guilty from Jump Street. And I don't need to go into the blatant racism demonstrated by the not guilty verdicts of white police officers in the killings of black, brown men and women. As change agents, if you're serious about being a change agent, there needs to be a major shift in our value system to create a new paradigm. Create a new paradigm in our value system. Peace, I'm out.
Wow. What an amazing way to get our panel started, don't you think? I mean, this is awesome. The other thing, before I ask, somebody ask a question of Sister Patty, I want to let you know, Sister Patty, that we still have opportunities for students at this school to go into a social change concentration, and we have examples of how there are jobs. There actually are jobs now where people can go and do from a social work value base, right? Really grounded in that. Changing the word, that's right. All right, so does somebody have a burning question for the one question that you can ask for Sister Patty at this time? Yes, John. Here. Oh, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being here. I just have one question. You touched on how massive of a conversation this is, and like, there's endless places to start, and it could go on for a lot longer than 15 minutes. But of course, we're all in this room because we want to have this conversation, and we're all, and I'm speaking from personal experience, I'm here because I'm really excited to have conversations like this. But from your own personal and professional experience, what's the best and most efficient way to start this conversation from people who don't necessarily want to have it as much as everyone else in this room does?
Good question. I think part of it, first of all, if we're truly serious about having this conversation, we must first of all acknowledge that racism exists and is alive and well. We can no longer put our heads in the sand and acting like it ain't happening, it ain't here. So first of all is being honest enough to acknowledge that racism exists. I think secondly, for white persons, if you're seriously wanting to look at this, then you also have to begin to look at what I call your internalized white superiority. Your internalized white superiority. And the work that you must do if you're choosing to be allies, and I know my sister's going to talk about that, but you have some homework that you all have to do in terms of unpacking your internalized white superiority. On the other hand, for those of us who are people of color, we got some homework we got to do too. And it's called unpacking our internalized racial oppression. For us as people of color, we got some internalized racial oppression that we oftentimes operate out of as well, which keeps us pitted against each other, oftentimes. And so that's where I think, my brother, we have to begin. And there are times when that homework has to be done with white people, that work has to be done, conversations, deepening that analysis amongst white folk. And as people of color, there are times we got to close the door and deal with our stuff too. We do. I mean, I'm at the point where I'm just pulling off the covers now from everybody. Everybody got work to do. And then only then can we begin to move forward in looking at how do we work together to dismantle the sick racism that exists in the fabric of this country.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Okay. We're going to move on. At the end, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, okay? So I want to move on. So thank you, Sister Patty. One of the systems that Sister Patty talked about that's complicit in perpetuating racism in our society is the social welfare system. And that's the system that many of us are going to be entering. And that's the system that Aja Taylor is going to be talking about when she talks about racism embedded in the nonprofit sector. And that's a place that you all will have a lot of close-up work to do and have power to make those changes. So while Aja is coming up to the podium, let me introduce her more formally. She is Bread for the City's newly minted advocacy department, the director of their advocacy department, where she works with, and she sent me this language, the dopest organizers and community leaders around.
Facts are facts.
Facts are facts, she's saying. She began at Bread as a community organizer in the Legal Clinic's Community Lawyering Project. Though she's only been organizing at Bread for 4 years, now that's a long time, that's not only. Her organizing experience dates back to her teenage years when in her role as the NAACP Youth Council President, she did grassroots organizing work around improving the conditions at Oak Hill Juvenile Detention Center. Some of you longer time Washingtonians will remember that. So thank you for doing that work. She comes to this work as a young black woman raised by socially conscious parents who always push their children to not just examine, but challenge oppressive systems. Aja is passionate about working with community members to build lasting infrastructure that will continue to develop leaders, put pressure on systems, and challenge the status quo long after she's retired to Tahiti with her rich husband. All right. Past wins in her work include the passage of the Fair Criminals Record Screening Act of 2014. We know it as Ban the Box. She helped win a transportation access for seniors living in Victory Square senior apartments, and 2 resolutions to protect and return rights for public housing residents whose properties are being redeveloped. All the gentrification, right, that's going on in our city. In addition to campaign work, Aja organizes and conducts political education workshops for Bread for the City client leaders and serves on the steering committee of the Fair Budget Coalition. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Bring it down because I'm short. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing today? So earlier, Linda had said something about being like the best anti-racist organizer around. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, I don't know about that. Let's manage our expectations. But I certainly did have the distinct privilege of being born Black. And because God wanted to show off, I was also a woman. But it's also important for me to say that I am imperfect. I don't know everything. And even the things I do know, I did not always know. And I say that because oftentimes when we learn things, we can actually tend to weaponize them against people, even in a quest for change, which is actually one of the ways that white supremacy works in us, even people who are Black or other people of color. It's one of the ways capitalism ruins us, that there is this idea that there is some scarcity of knowledge and some scarcity of ability to be a leader in a certain issue, and therefore I must take my knowledge and put you down with it. And so that's not what we're going to do today. I am going to keep it real. And so, you know, but when things come up like that's natural, it's fine. And when we have the Q&A portion, I really look forward to like a robust question and answer period. The other framing I would offer is that I'm also a troublemaker and a rabble-rouser, and I'm a practicing Episcopalian who knows God, and I know a God who doesn't play, and I follow a Jesus Christ who was persecuted because of his Blackness also, right? That anti-Blackness is very present in the Bible and in what happened to Christ. And I follow a Jesus and know a Jesus who was turning over tables in the temple, right? So I know there's lots of Christ that people like to follow. My favorite Christ is the turn-up Christ, who went hard for what had to happen, even as he knew that his death was imminent, right? Even as he knew that he would have to pay one day the ultimate price. And so I'm contextualizing that not only because, you know, I'm at Catholic University and some of my clips have cuss words, and I am a Christian, but also to offer this very real context that, like, so we're not asking social workers to go in and die for this, right? Not at this presentation. That's the 201. But right here in the 101, right, you ain't got to die for this today. But we are asking, and right now I'm speaking for my fellow panelists, but I think I can, you know, a little bit. What we are asking you to do is challenge your own expectations and challenge your own assumptions about social work and the social work field. So I'm actually going to start with a question, which is, why do people even think it's important? So you guys are social workers, you're going to go in the nonprofit field. Why does it even matter that we should talk about race and racism when you're like social workers and nonprofits and you know, it's full of well-meaning people who do great work, which is true. You're kidding, right? Everyone's like, no, I have no idea. You were gonna tell us everything. Right here.
For the worth and dignity of every individual.
Okay, so for the dignity of every individual, why else?
So you don't perpetuate the institutional racism and your own biases into practice.
So you don't perpetuate the institutional racism and your own biases into your practice?
Most people don't even realize the biases that they have, and so they can't see how those play out because they don't even know what they're doing.
What's another word for that kind of bias?
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias, right? So yes, all of these things are right. Is there one more burning thing someone wants to offer? Yeah.
Because we're poised to be in a position to help make a difference, particularly code change agent.
Totally, right? because social workers and people in nonprofit industry in general are absolutely perfectly poised to be really critical change agents, not just inside of their own agencies, but inside of the world. The other reason that I will say, and I'm glad that Sister Patty brought this up, is because nonprofits, and this is different in lots of cities, but particularly in big cities, definitely in the local DC context, nonprofits have a lot of power. And nonprofits are very white. And so when we talk about what it looks like for a misuse of power, right? When we have a conversation about misuse of power, one of the ways that nonprofits frequently and consistently misuse our power is by actually weaponizing it against the people that we serve. And we're gonna talk about that today. So I'm gonna break this down into 3 main sections of conversation. I'm gonna open my little paper. My 3 bullet points that I probably could have put on a Post-it note. So we're gonna talk about racism in the field, right? So how racism shows up in looking at a snapshot of the social work field. We're gonna look at how racism shows up in the workplace, and I have a clip for that. And then we're gonna talk about how racism shows up in the actual execution of the work. Before I move forward, do people have questions? Perfect. So how racism shows up in the field. Who would be surprised if I said that the social work field is overwhelmingly white? No one, great. Does anyone want to guess a percentage share of like all social workers in the country? 80, 75, 60, 89, yeah, so in 2015, it was like 81, and then in 2014, it dropped to like 78, but still a very significant portion, a very significant percentage of people who practice social work in various capacities, so not just people who are doing case management, but people who have social work degrees, period, some who are doing advocacy, some who find themselves in the military. It's overwhelmingly white, and at a rate that, so even though there are more white people who access public benefits, and perhaps, even though there's no concrete data on this, I'm making a linear like inference that there are possibly more white people than who are like accessing social services sometimes, but it is not, there are more white people accessing social services relative to other races. So like for SNAP, it's something like 40%. For TANF, it falls almost like a third. But that isn't proportional to their share. So it is not, 80% is not proportional to their share in who is actually receiving benefits. What I just said was confusing. And so if I were to say it more succinctly than that, 40% of white people are accessing benefits, but there are 80% of the social work field is white. That would have been actually a way more succinct way to do that bullet point. This is why you write full notes, everyone, and do it so you can read your own handwriting. It's important, it's critical, right? This is a learning moment for all of us. It's a teach-in, right? It's a teach-in. So it's overwhelmingly white. And why does that matter? Or why might that matter? For real, no, it's a teach-in, it's not a panel. Why might it matter? Yeah.
Because the internalized biases of service providers are probably affecting the services that are being given.
Yeah, right? So those implicit biases that you were talking about are more likely to come into play. Anything else? Because I suppose the
clientele may not be more comfortable asking for something they see comes like a white male.
Totally. Yeah, fact. That you walk in, it's someone, you're just like, I don't even know, my interactions with white men have not been positive, and now this person is supposed to be responsible for my care, right, or my welfare, or I'm supposed to trust them to advocate for my best interests, I'm supposed to trust them to like help get my children back, I'm supposed to trust them to do all of these things, and I can't. Right, and something that's really big is in social work, like any really like public health, I think of social work as in the public health realm. Trust is really important, right? When you have clients, when you have patients, trust is really important. The other question I have is, do we think that this is because more white people are capable of being social workers? Right. right? So what are some of the reasons that might exist for the overwhelming number of white social workers who are working in nonprofit fields?
Access to education.
Access to education. What else?
Hiring practices. Not a lot of money in the field.
Not a lot of money in the field. Why does that matter?
Unfortunately, I think a lot of people, minorities, you may come from poor backgrounds, so then I grow up, I need to make some money.
Yeah.
I pursue something where I'm going to get some money.
So what she said was, people feel like I need to pursue something where I'm going to make some money. I have this conversation with my coworkers all the time and other people who hire people. And I'm like, this is why we have to pay people. Because you know what? When I was a little black girl, my mom was like, and also I don't want to work all my life. So it'd be great if you could work somewhere where you can, you know, help me out. We're going to like flip the script. Like that would be ideal. And yet then I chose nonprofit world. And then she just started. That's why the rich husband is in there in the bio, because I'm really kind of dependent on it at this point. Because like I love Bread for the City and we're never going to like pay anyone $1 million, so which is great, which is fine, whatever, we do good work. But for a lot of like little black girls, little black boys, little black children, like it wasn't like, oh yeah, like grow up and then like go be poor forever. That was not, you know, that isn't why our parents made sacrifices and that kind of stuff. So when you look at the fact that there is and even systemically, so when you look at the fact that there is an actual wage gap, right? When you were living in 2017 and the wage gap, black women in particular are experiencing the largest wage gap of anyone. It makes it so that it's not just like, oh, you know, I want to be rich. It's like, I actually want to be able to take care of myself, one day have a child or two and be able to feed them and myself, you know, a luxury like that, and maybe live in a place where I want to live. Maybe I want to have some choice about where I live, you know, before my family is displaced out of our neighborhood. And what that means is that people are almost being forced to make choices. And so that for white folks and for white women in particular, and white men in particular, where the wage gap is lower, where when you look at national debt, the number of white folks in deep debt is different. People are able to have access to different choices, and frankly are able to like truly follow passions. Like, you know, we all grow up, or we're all taught, or maybe not we all, but many of us are taught when we're younger, like, you know, you can grow up and you can do anything. And it's really false, because a lot of us are like born into debt. A lot of us are born into zip codes where so much of our life is predetermined. And what that means is that even our desire to give back is limited. It is severely limited. And so you have a field like social work, or you have a field like nonprofit work in general, that ends up being overwhelmingly and at times unbearably white, which means that all of the things that come with whiteness, to be clear, which is not totally separate and apart from white people, but like whiteness and white supremacy are things that I try to talk about absent people, because really like white supremacy is the enemy, right? So it's not to say the white people are the enemy, but white supremacy absolutely is killing the environment. White supremacy is killing like the animals. White supremacy is killing black people. White supremacy has decimated, like, you know, 60% of DC's entire Chinese population lives in one building, and also they want to destroy it. Like, that's crazy, right? White supremacy is literally killing people. And so this is why it is so imperative that we destroy it. So that's kind of like how racism shows up and even how the field is made up. And someone else said hiring practices, which actually is a perfect segue into how it shows up in the workplace. So who said hiring practices? I did. Say more. So how does hiring practices factor in to who gets to work at a nonprofit?
Well, my idea was that a lot of times people hire people like them, just in general. And
Preach. That's absolutely right. Yes, people hire people like them, right? More often than not. I do it. I do it, right? I mean, if I send something to my social networks are largely black, right? It happens. The problem isn't necessarily that people send things to their social networks. The problem is there are far fewer Aja Taylors in positions of power at nonprofits for that to actually have an effect that will disproportionately affect white candidates. Conversely, white people who have overwhelmingly white social networks, to your very excellent point, means that intent aside, right, that you have to do an overwhelming amount of work to overcome the very real barrier that you're posting in places where your peers post, or you send it to your friends and they're white, or you send it to your professional organizations and they're white, or you send it to your sorority and it's white, or you send it to your fraternity and it's white, and it just has this effect where, exactly what you're saying, that just the access is limited because literally the access is limited. People do not even know about opportunities. In fact, when I became a community organizer at Bread for the City in 2012, I didn't even know community organizing was a job people got paid for. I was like, wow, because I've been doing this for free for a long time. I mean, you know, because like I'm Black, and so I'm doing this because like trying to get free, right? I didn't know I could get free and not have it be for free too. I didn't know that those things were an option. But when I came and I was hired and I was going to these meetings and I was the fly in the milk, is there someone who's like, what's the fly in the milk? The fly in the milk is like the only Black person in the room. And so when I was the fly in the milk, and also I've always been myself. So like, even though I say like I haven't always known what I've known like things were racist since probably like 3rd grade. So, you know, I was already like, hey, like also, does anyone else think it's weird that like I'm the only Black person? I'm also the only like non-licensed, you know, whatever attorney or social worker or whatever at the time. They're like, God damn it, she's always coming in here talking about race and racism. And this is why we have to have these meetings with only attorneys, because like only attorneys understand what we're talking about, and she's trying to make this about race, and it's not, it's about the law. And I'm like, I'm just trying to tell you the law is racist, boo. I'm just trying to tell you that the law is racist, boo. Okay, I'm trying to make you better. You want to be better, I want you to be better. It's gonna be good for all of us. And what I also found out when I went into other rooms with other organizers, where I was also the fly in the milk, right, is that the organizing field, especially as it related to issues that disproportionately affected Black people, which is like everything, that also was overwhelmingly white. And so even though I didn't know that people were getting paid for community organizing, clearly somebody knew, right? Because I was like, yeah, and it's my first day. And they're like, yeah, no, totally. I've been here for like 4 years. I'm like, God, 4 years? And you know, because I'm 26 and you're 22, I'm just trying to figure out like how you been here 4 years. You knew this? You knew that they were paying people to fight displacement for real, and you're not even from here, but you knew. Wow, what message board was it? I'm just trying to figure out what message board that's on so that I can also get on this, you know, because I'm just over here on Indeed trying to like, you know, I thought that was good enough. Happened to see something on Idealist when I was at my other job and I wasn't even supposed to be on the internet, but like I was like, oh man, this looks cool. Yeah, so there are all these ways that like race and racism play into who's gonna show up in the room. And what happens when everyone in the room is white and is divorced from or removed from the experience of the people who they're representing? Not a trick question. Yeah.
They assume what people need, they assume what their clients or people they're serving need.
Come on, Pastor.
The law.
Oh yeah, they assume they know what they need. I've been a social worker for 15 years. I've seen a lot of Black people and they have told me their problems. And I'm just telling you, Aja, that I do understand what happens and what the challenges of being Black are, and we're gonna create this policy and we're gonna do it absent talking to anyone, and it's gonna be great, except it's never great. It never works, and you end up with policies that either further, to the point over here, right, further perpetuate racism, right, or you end up with policies that are incredibly paternalistic and that clearly make assumptions about poor Black people and how they spend their money, right? You end up with restrictions on EBT against like crabs and steak because God forbid, right, poor Black people eat crabs. Even though poor Black people been eating crabs, like go to the Eastern Shore, brother, okay. Poor Black people been eating crabs. Steak comes from a cow. Poor black people been farming, boo. We've been eating steak, honey. You want to come in here and teach me how to garden? Baby, I don't know if you know this, but there was this whole thing called, well, there was slavery. And also, then there was sharecropping. I just want you to know, we don't want to not community garden because we don't know how to garden. We just like over it. We're just like, actually. We did a lot of gardening. And you know, no thanks. No, Sue, you want to do it, Sue? Baby, I want them zucchini. I don't want to be in here digging and stuff. You know, for some people it's therapeutic. I don't speak for all black people, but for many of us, we're like, And also for many of us, community gardens, like other things that are deemed neighborhood amenities, are things that we see as signs, right? Like this is a sign. They didn't build this, like we have not had a grocery store for 4 decades, and now we have not a grocery store, but we got this garden though. And even though we ain't gonna get but like 4 zucchinis from this whole garden, like maybe if we all eat together and make one salad, we can all get fed off this one garden. When Sue goes home, she goes upstairs to her apartment that's above Safeway at City Vista that used to be, right? And so you end up with solutions for black folks that are inadequate. You end up with solutions to immigration policy for my Latino folks and my Latinx folks that are inadequate. They are inadequate, woefully inadequate. And it happens that way because these decisions are made absent involvement from community, absent voice from community. And when community does come in, it is after all of these well-meaning white people have actually already decided, I know what you need. Where are you at, fam? Right here. I know what you need. I know what the problem is. And not only do I know the problem, but baby, I got you. I already know the solution. You're welcome. Right? And you should be grateful for that. That is what the people who we serve have been taught, that they should be grateful for that. I'll tell you an anecdote about my interactions, because I just want to be like, don't be this person. And then I'm gonna play one clip. I organize folks in communities, and many of the people who I organize with, I have the pleasure of organizing with and turning up with, are people who have social workers or case managers. Maybe they're housing insecure or they're receiving services at another organization. So there was a woman named Ms. Flo, and she was like 68. And she was homeless because she had the audacity to want to stay in DC, where she had lived and contributed, her lifetime and money, and didn't want to move with her daughters who had chosen to move, who were doing well, but had chosen to move to other parts of the country, right? And so she found herself in this transitional shelter. But Miss Flo liked to turn up, right? She had this activist background. Miss Flo also liked to walk dogs. And so she was like, she came into Bedford City one day and she was like, someone told me, go see Aja if I'm trying to turn up. Fact, come see me. Goes for all of you if you're like, this sounds great, the turn up sounds great. Come see me, okay? So she came and saw me and we had this great conversation. So fast forward, Flo has helped us build this dope campaign, even though she had never been in prison, was really dope at organizing people who had been to jail. And I needed Flo to come to this training that was overnight training. So I'm really good at getting things for free. And so I had gotten this opportunity, because people asked me to come do things, and you can ask Linda, I was like, yeah, girl, I can come and do that for free if you can do something for me. I'm all about bartering. I'm anti-capitalist, right? Ain't nothing free, baby. So I had bartered myself away for this training, for these slots for participants, and I was so excited because Miss Flo was gonna get a chance to go. And I had some other seniors from our Victory Square work. And so I was like, yeah, girl. She was like, well, I have to get approval from my social worker. And I was like, that sounds weird because you're grown, but whatever. I don't know the rules of your program or the rules of your program. That's hint number one. When the rules of your program are the rules of your program, the rules are racist, they're bad rules. They're bad rules. Feel free to break those, right? An unjust law is not one you should follow. That's like a paraphrase of Dr. Martin Luther King. I take it to heart, okay? So she, comes to me the day before we're supposed to leave, and it's just in Baltimore, okay? I'm not taking her Jamaica. So she comes to me the day before we're supposed to leave, and she's like crying, and she's like, I can't go. And I'm like, why? And she was like, my social worker said, I have a dog walking job, and I want to see my daughter while she's in town, and that's already my 2 weekends, so I can't go to the training. And I said, oh no, girl, you just must not have explained it to her, that this isn't a leisure activity. This is like a you're black and trying to get free activity, and this is a free training that another social service. I was like, girl, just tell her Bread for the City, because usually that works. I'm like, girl, just tell her Bread for the City said it's cool, like have her call me. So the woman calls me. Her name's Jen. I'm gonna go ahead and tell you her name because whatever, it doesn't matter, there are a million Jens. And Jen is like, hello. And I'm like, yeah, hey, Jen. Flo was telling me that she couldn't come to the training. I just wanted to tell you what it's about. And so I'm like, tell you, it's this great training put on by Win. And she's like, yeah, so, the thing is, like, I understand that and I sympathize, but also, like, I just feel like Flo needs to learn responsibility. And so I said, Jen, how old are you, Jen? I'm like, just for laughs, how old are you, Jen, girl? And I already knew she was white because everyone who works at this place is white, except for the janitorial staff, but that's different. I mean, that's for the next training. That's for the next training. But all the people who manage cases there are white women. And so, I didn't need that much, but I was like, how old are you, Jen? And she's like, 28. And I'm like, yeah, okay, Jen, cool. So you probably know a lot. Because I'm 28 too, Jen. I get it, we smart. But also, did you know that Flo has whole entire children who could have been our mothers? Like, do you know that she has whole entire grown kids? Jen, darling, that she's raised an entire family, that she actually works, she manages her own schedule, she's about to help us pass this bill. Like, Jen, what'd you do today? Right, what you done in your 28 years, right? Because she seems pretty responsible to me. And so there are all of these very paternalistic views about black people, about black women, about black children, right? About children of color and men of color and women of color and people of color, because let's not forget our trans and gender nonconforming folks, right? Where we are constantly pathologized. We are constantly pathologized and infantilized, right? And essentially told that we are not capable of making our own decisions. And so people end up making trades on us. People who have never experienced homelessness, right, end up getting to decide finally what is or is not included in a policy for homeless people, which is overwhelmingly black and overwhelmingly women, right? There are 0 white children in poverty, and yet there are white people who get to decide every day whether or not we have an education voucher system, whether or not we have certain things in the classroom, whether or not, our per pupil formula makes sense. And so when we talk about why it's important, it's beyond diversity, right? Because diversity is but it's a first step. So if your place is struggling with diversity, it's a good first step before you jump to also things are racist and this is white supremacy at work. Diversity is a good first step, but it's really important and really critical that we be unafraid and really bold and unafraid to challenge the systems that be, even inside of our own places of work, because literally people's lives depend on it. This is not hyperbole. Okay? Black people, brown people are killed by this system every day. And as social workers, you will be, to someone's point, key potential agents of change. But it means not only figuring out how to undo the whiteness and white supremacy that shows up in your work, but undoing the whiteness and white supremacy that shows up in yourself, right?
Aja, could I?
And I'm gonna conclude, because I could go on for another 30 minutes, but we're gonna have a robust question to answer. I believe in y'all.
Yeah. That's great. Awesome. 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 Yeah, I mean, it's a good note for Aja to end on, right? That these are life and death issues, right? Our attention to dismantling racist systems are life and death issues, particularly for social workers. Does somebody have one question that we could ask Aja before we move on to Eleanor? Yes.
Excuse me for not standing up. So you talked about being the black fly in the milk. Yeah. So, and not speaking for all black people. And it made me think of being the token black person. How do you balance representing who you are and being who you are and also not having everyone assume that you can speak for your entire community?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I will say, I am myself in all places I go. And so I'm really good at actually telling people that in the language that seems most accessible to them. Saying, I actually don't represent all Black people like I did up here on the podium. I also am always, if you're gonna make me the token, like I'm not the ideal token. So like usually when people choose a token, they choose someone who's gonna like go along to get along. That's right. I am, as when I introduced myself to the dean, I said, I am an unorthodox choice, and so I appreciate being invited. And maybe I'll be invited back, but maybe not. There are places where I go and I'm not invited back. There are places where I go and rules are made after I leave. I mean, and so like by being myself, and perhaps this is actually a message for like the Black folks and like other people of color in the room, is that I have found it's not always easy, but I always feel good about it. And so people who like don't want to bang with me afterwards, I'm like, you know, you probably weren't kin anyway. And so it's cool, because like chances are, I didn't really bang with you either. So like, this is fine. And that actually what I do view my responsibility as a Black person who has a position of decision-making power at an organization that is one of the largest and more powerful social service organizations in the city, is that my role is to like continuously challenge the status quo and make room, right? To make room. I always make sure I can bring somebody with me. Terry, she's over there. Hey, Terry. Because, you know, and I said, text me if you have a problem, because I'll turn up right here in Catholic, because you got to let my people in. You know what I'm saying? Like, I try not to go places alone because I don't represent all Black people.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll invite her back. We'll invite you back, Aja, if you'll come back. Okay. Now I want to introduce Eleanor Hancock from White Awake, who will talk about white allyship. Why don't you head up to the podium? As I said, Eleanor Hancock is the director of White Awake, a national platform that brings contemplative spiritual practice to anti-racism educational materials designed specifically for white people, right? So you heard Sister Patty had said, sometimes white people have to get in the room together and talk about stuff, right? And talk about their own privilege and history, white supremacy, and that's what Eleanor Hancock's organization does and helps facilitate. So her belief is that knowledge and spiritual clarity offer white people the tools we need to not act only as allies of people of color, indigenous peoples, but also to make this struggle our own. Hopefully you will want to be engaged as white people in anti-racism work because it's about your liberation, right? I mean, your liberation is tied to the end of the dismantling of racism in our society. Eleanor's leadership within White Awake grows out of years of experience as an activist, academic, artist, educator, and mother of a biracial child. She's trained directly with Joanna Macy in the work that reconnects and integrates this Buddhist-based deep ecology practice into her facilitation of integrative race-based group work. So let's welcome Eleanor.
All right, let me get comfortable with the microphone. I don't use these that often. Does this seem good? Okay. So I have all kinds of thoughts rolling around in my head now because we had these two speakers and I have my notes, and so we're going to see what comes out of me. I feel like just because I'm tired, I just want to say that my mom's been in the hospital. She was in the intensive care unit like 2 nights ago. So if there's any lack of energy that I bring today, hopefully there won't be. But if there is, it's not about my passion about this subject matter. So yeah, you all, from my bio, you know a little bit about what I do. I direct this project called White Awake. It's a really young organization. And we have online resources that people can tap into to create their own educational experiences in their organizations, their spiritual communities. We offer trainings, which a lot of times is me still, but we also do leadership development. So I'm really excited about developing, you know, waves of leaders who can do this kind of work with white folks. I'm also on the steering committee of the DC chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice. That is a national network of, it's not all white people, it's primarily white people, but the focus is organizing and bringing in and providing avenues for white people to come into anti-racist work. And it's very focused on activism, but there's base building, bringing people in and educating them is part of preparing people, and it's ongoing. It's not like you get ready and then you go do activism. Let's see what I want to say. The heart of, with Showing Up for Racial Justice, the heart of that work is partnering with organizations and groups and networks that are folks of color, that are led by people addressing the needs of their own community, they're directly, and so partnering with them. So it's like the opposite of what happens in the, that's been outlined by Aja and Sister Patty. It's the opposite of the paternalistic role of helping or saving. It's getting white people into situations where they're in real relationships with communities and organizations and groups of color so that we can support their work and work alongside them. And I know I'll just say that for our chapter here in DC, I mean, there are people who are willing to do direct action and show up in dangerous situations, and we have people who were in Charlottesville, and when they came back, they had to jump out of the way of that car. They were in the middle of, life-threatening, they didn't know when they were going to die for a long time, and they came back, and part of what our networks also did is provide support for them in terms of healing and the PTSD that they were coming home with. So this is really people who are deeply committed, for their life to this struggle. And that piece of my bio is really true, is that you're not going to do that because it's quote unquote the right thing to do. You're not going to do that because you feel guilty. And so really understanding deeply what white supremacy is and where it comes from and why you are white is vital to engaging in this struggle. And so that is kind of the core of my work, is more around the educational and spiritual component, but completely linked to activism and maybe risking your life, but definitely giving your life to this struggle because it is destroying everything. And, it's like we're looking at these superstorms, and I mean, we're looking at an incredible amount of destruction. One of my, someone that I admire and look up to is Chris Crass. Some of you all might know him. He's been an organizer for a long time. He just refers to white supremacy and capitalism as a death culture. And I think that is a very accurate shorthand. It is not life-affirming. It is not generative. It is a death culture, which means it's in everybody's interest, no matter who you are, to work against it. Let's see. There's a few different things that I want to share with you. I think I'll say a little bit more, kind of break down some of what White Awake does, because it tells you a little bit more about what I think is the baseline of personal development that white people need in order to engage in this struggle. And so that's part of being an ally. And then I'm going to go more specifically into allyship. But in terms of the work we do with White Awake, part of that is to reject that toxic social conditioning, which has been outlined really well already. And then not just reject it, though, you have to replace it with something that is going to be affirming. And so spiritual practice, cultural practice, for a lot of people, it's understanding who you were and who your family was before you were white. You might not try to recreate your ethnicity, but you should at least know something. And some people are so far removed, they don't even know. And that's part of the violence that's been done in creating a group of people to be dominant, to keep an economic system in place. Which takes me to my second point, which is that white people need to understand that racism is a manipulative device. That is becoming more and more clear. This election cycle made that incredibly clear. Just straight up divide and conquer. It is not in anybody's interest. The people who are in power in the federal government right now, a lot of them came from corporations. They're like, let's cut the middleman. So white people have been created. It's a thing that's been created so that white people will at large work against their own self-interest in order to protect the power of a very small number of people, and that's been the way it's been since the beginning of capitalism. Sometimes a lot of what I do, and like I'm in the middle of teaching an online workshop, is like teaching white people in particular, but everyone needs to know this history about like where capitalism came from and colonialism, and like why did all these masses of people come from Europe to, you know, Turtle Island to begin with? And a lot of them were rounded up, you know, and they were taken here as indentured servants. And whiteness as a law, as a legal thing, was created because those indentured servants and the enslaved Africans, they were pretty much living the same kind of life, and they were, you know, joining together to like kick out the, you know, the control of the ruling class, basically. And so the ruling class created white. That didn't exist before. And it has been the most powerful tool to keep all of this stuff in place. And at this point now, you have generations upon generations of the privilege that's accumulated around being white. So you have like the wealth gap and the education gap, and you have like what we have in mass incarceration. But at the core, it's a divide and conquer strategy. And I think when we know that, when we know our own history, then we're not coming at this from a position of uncertainty or weakness. And a lot of that implicit bias, what I feel is a lot of that implicit bias does begin to actually just fall away on its own when we have accurate information. We've been fed lies and misinformation, or had our eyes diverted from the truth. And when we actually get truth, then we start to, you know, and develop relationships with people, then it's the implicit bias starts to fall away. So the third main reason why I do the work that I do is to make sure that white people are equipped to sustain their engagement in multiracial coalitions to break this thing down. And so, yeah, if you can't just sit around in a room and learn how to be a better white person, you know. The point is to work with other people. The point is to actually get this whole thing to stop before it destroys everything. So that's where I'm coming from. And so I just want to speak just for a moment to kind of state what is kind of obvious, but sometimes when you speak about something that everybody knows, it's nice to define it, which is the term ally has grown out of identity politics. And identity politics is basically mapping and identifying ourselves and other people in the context of social hierarchies. So like I'm white, I'm a woman, middle class is a little, you know, that's not totally set, but in terms of my educational level, definitely middle class, you know, so I'm queer, you know, there's a variety of things going on there. I grew up Christian, but I'm not Christian anymore, so then I'm not part of a dominant religion. There's a lot of different things there, so I can look at them when I interact with someone, okay, well, what's your list, and like, where are you coming from, and then how are we socialized, and what kind of power do we have relative to one another? That's identity politics. So in that realm, ally means one part of our relationship, we're in different power dynamics in terms of the hierarchy. So like an ally would be like a man who's supporting women who are working to liberate themselves from sexism and patriarchy. So then white people who are allies are supporting people of color and fighting back against racial oppression. Overall, I think to enter into this whole field, you have to know that there's, you have to develop a lot of your own discernment and your own maturity, because there are things about identity politics that are necessary. We have to be able to see these things and talk about them and understand them and navigate them. But at the same time, it can become very rigid. Some of you all, if you're part of like the activist, you know, threads on Facebook or whatever, you've seen this article passed around that says, excommunicate me from the Church of Social Justice. I don't know if anyone has seen that. But it can become very rigid and overly simplified, and it becomes impossible to actually have real meaningful relationships that result in change. And so the other thing so that's kind of a general, like, watch out for that, you know, if you get too attached to identity politics. But the thing about ally in general that's challenging is that it does not, as a term, speak to the way in which these social hierarchies and privileges divide us from one another. It can also encourage us to enter into work out of a feeling of guilt or kind of like a moralism, like you should do this. And I'm gonna tell you, if you wanna call other white people in, that's actually not the way to do it. You should, because if you don't, you're bad. Like that really actually never motivates anyone. and it doesn't speak to the self-interest that we have. So for me, that's part of coming from contemplative practice and coming from just an observation of how life is. It's also good community organizing practice, right? Like 101, you identify self-interest, and people act out of that, and we act because we join our self-interests together. Now that's difficult to do across the landmines of everything that's just been spoken of, you know, the cultural and institutional racism that's created horrific differences between us in terms of privilege and what we have access to. But at the root, that's what we need, and we need to know that we need it, not that we're doing it for somebody else. So in terms of my work with white people, you know, there's a lot of like doing that work in white caucus spaces or learning our history or developing our like support networks so that we have people we can talk to. Like, you know, with Robin DiAngelo and White Fragilities, a lot has been spoken about like white women's tears in particular. Like you don't cry in front of people of color about like how bad you feel because they called you out. That's true, you don't. But you need your people that you can go cry to and talk to. So that's part of being an ally, is that you have your support networks who are other white people who are on this path. Yeah, so from the perspective of what I do then, if I think about that term ally, I'm thinking more specifically about the work that white people do in direct relationship with people of color. How do we show up? And then that specifically applies to, this is a great segue from Aja, what you shared, when you're working with people on things that directly impact their community and you're not part of that community, then they know what they need. And so you prioritize their leadership. That's just like baseline for being an ally. There are a few points I thought I would cover. Let's see, 5 minutes? Yeah, that's great. Let's see, Yeah, there's some general, I have like these like 5 points somehow that there was some segue that I missed, but doesn't matter. So there's a few points I'll leave you with that are, I guess, my tips for you in developing your ability to oops, I think I turned it off. Did I? No, maybe it's a battery. Oh, maybe, yeah. I feel like I pushed a button right when that happened. All right, so here we go. One is, so some of this will be reiterating some things I've already said, but one is learn your history. Know the history of the group to which you belong. This is really true for everyone, but speaking as someone who works with white people, you know, you've got to unpack it, mourn it, create spaces where you can grieve. Because there's no way anybody can encounter this history and not grieve. And if you don't, then you're probably not going to have that deeper level of resilience that you need to stay engaged in the work. And then find that place of inner resolve inside of yourself where you can stay committed to this. You can draw other white people in, you can speak to them, you can come from a place of love, which does not exclude firmness, but it means it's not brittle. You understand you're not helping someone else and that you know what your stake is and stay connected to that. The second point is to understand your own social conditioning. And this is really like where like a huge workshop, you know, and numbers of workshops happen around this to unwind your social conditioning. Part of that is just to understand the traits, the general things you've been conditioned into. Someone who's done a lot of work around that is Robin DiAngelo. I'm not always honestly in love with her work because I do feel like it can be pretty shaming and blaming, but she outlines a lot of the programming that white people receive that's there to keep us in that position of being white so that we don't actually work against white supremacy, right? Because if white people divested our energies from white supremacy, it could not stand. So that's part of what's exciting about some of the work that's happening right now is it's becoming more obvious to white people overall that this is real and it implicates us and there's no neutral. So understand things like this, you know, the general assumption of white authority and white superiority. Even if you don't believe it in your mind, you have probably lived a life where you experienced it in an embodied way to such an extent, it is hard not to step into that. You have to watch out for it. And other things like believing that we are in a meritocracy and you just get what you deserve because you worked hard, which if you flip that means if people are poor, then they didn't work hard. You know, people are in prison, it's because they're criminals. So there's things we've been trained into us. There's a lot of these, I'd encourage you to do work where you understand what that programming is, and as you learn it, you can start to see it in yourself. And if you pair that with some kind of contemplative personal practice, a self-awareness practice, then you have that space to see and notice those traits when they come up in your own behavior. And then in terms of actually acting out in the world, of course, you all are preparing to be social workers. I'm thinking about this as an activist, but basically understand what's happening where you live. Know who's organizing around what are the front lines of white supremacy where you live. In DC, gentrification is a huge front line, policing and private prisons, and that's all a huge front line in DC. Who are the people of color? Who are the people who are on the front lines of that? And what kind of, how can you build a solidarity relationship with them? And I've already stated this, but yeah, if the group, that you are supporting their work, you're not coming in as a savior. And yeah, understand some of the pitfalls of the social justice culture, which I already spoke to, and work to develop a real mutual relationship with the people that you're in relationship with. There's actually a couple resources that if there's some kind of follow-up on this, I can share the links to. It was really exciting to have Sister Patty from Pax Christi, because I have a resource that I love that I found just Googling accountable relationships with people of color online. It jumped to the top, but it's a Pax Christi resource. Building accountable relationships with communities of color is excellent. And there's a lot of incredible material there. One point that they talk about is this is a theme. I'm gonna say it now for like the 4th time, and so it'll be like the 5th or 6th time you've heard this since someone's been up here talking, is like this idea of speaking and acting on behalf of people of color rather than being accountable to people of color is huge. And one thing that this document brings out, just as a note, is that there's an irony that in the white peace movement overall, that more time and resources have been built spending relationships with community of color in other countries, and then right here in the cities where people actually live. And that's just that's a tell, right? Because you have more control when it's somebody else over there. And when it's somebody else right here, I'm not going to remember it, but there's a Catholic, I don't know if he's just a bishop, a priest, who has this great searing lecture he gave to a bunch of do-gooders at one point. He's like, you're about to all go over there to South America, to help these people. You should go to your own neighborhoods where at least people can say fuck you in their own language to you. So, all right, so, I know I'm getting close to time. Do I have a couple minutes, or shall I? Okay, so I'll wrap this up. I'll just look at my notes here. What are things I haven't said I want to highlight? One is develop some resilience to shame. And that is huge because we live in a very shaming culture. And if you study old history, it's been this way for hundreds of years, y'all, okay? People got put in stocks in the middle of town and stuff. I mean, we have a very controlling, shaming culture that white supremacy comes out of, and you gotta be resilient to that and look at things that are maybe a mistake or even just an offense. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Did I make a mistake, or did I step on, did I step on their toe? I don't know. But either way, look at that as an opportunity to grow and an opportunity to learn and even deepen the relationship, as opposed to, failure. And then, I'll just close by saying it can be helpful to understand, to have a racial identity development model. Hopefully that's something you guys are learning in some of your classes. But know that there's phases of development that you go through, and especially try not to get stuck in the zealous phase. There's a phase of this where you just get woken up and you're like, oh my God, and so you're beating other people over the head and you're actually acting more out of guilt and maybe some self-hatred. That's something you have to keep going all the way through. You need to be grounded in the work that you're doing. You need to be seeking joyful, fulfilling relationships and meaningful activities, because this is a multi-generational project. So you need to be in it for the long haul, and it's got to be sustainable for that. Okay, that's what I got.
Awesome. That's awesome. I wanted to mention that there are some sign-up sheets. So part of SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice, has developed some materials to help educate white people on this issue in a very, a real but gentle, part of the violence, as you mentioned and Eleanor mentioned, and is the violence in the social justice movement. And that's the violence that I was speaking of at the beginning, right? So it's good to have restorative practice as part of your work and to be journeying with a group. So we wanted to offer an opportunity for our white students who are still, there's a lot to learn as lifelong learning. Want to delve deeper into this. We're starting a surge showing up for Racial Justice DC reading group. It's 7 sessions. We would like to organize 1 per month, and it's 2 hours. And I have some sign-up sheets that I will leave out on the where you walked in to register. If you're interested in this, then I'll send out a doodle poll. I'll be facilitating, depending on how many people sign up. Groups have to be between 8 and 15 to have good time for processing and conversation. But you'll be getting a doodle poll if you're interested to find times that we can gather for this academic year together to delve further. So we'll put that out at the break. And a question for Eleanor. What question do you have for Eleanor? One question. Yes.
I would ask her, what would you say to the white person who makes a disparaging remark on minorities and Indians, but I'm not a racist?
Did you hear it? So what would you say to the white person who makes a disparaging remark to a black person and then says, or a person of color and says, but I'm not a racist?
Well, first of all, true disclosure is I try to work primarily with the people who want to work on this because there's a lot of them and they need avenues and roads in. That said, yeah, obviously you want to say something and that'll depend on who you are and what your relationship is to that person. Yeah, I mean, if it's someone you don't know very well, then you probably just want to really assert, you know what, that was a racist remark. And racism is not even a personal thing anyway. It's like a whole, I don't know. You just assert something and then maybe leave it. I don't know. If that's someone you're in relationship with, though, you should assert something at the time and look for a way to bring them into a conversation that builds off of your connection with them. And a lot of times, especially if you have a relationship with someone, if you can find and honor their best intentions, everyone, almost everyone, has some kind of good intentions. And so when you honor that, they relax, and then they're more receptive to the rest of what you have to say.
Awesome. Okay, more to come on all this. Now, last but never least is Indira Hennard. Again, one of our social change graduates from a few years ago. So Indira, do you want to make your way to the podium while I give you your introduction? She's the executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. She's been there for the last 10 years, serving in different capacities, lending invaluable experience, including leadership roles in fundraising operations, cultivating relationships and strategic partnerships, as well as coalition building. Her experience in many gender-based violence programs has helped to inform her policy analysis that has led to coordinating public policy initiatives and organizing planning spaces for survivor-led advocacy. Spanning over 20 years of dedicated service in the violence against women's movement, Indira's experience exemplifies her expertise in nonprofit management, organizational development, education, training, fundraising, and public policy. Most recently, she has expanded her work internationally to include providing high-level training and technical assistance to local nonprofits and NGOs overseas and building capacity and infrastructure to respond to gender-based violence, including in Lagos, Nigeria, and working with an international coalition of NGOs. She holds her MSW from here, we're so proud, and held many other numerous fellowship positions. She also served as a Senate aide for Senator, you may have heard of him, Barack Obama on Capitol Hill, and was a special assistant on his presidential campaign. She was most recently awarded the National Victim Impact Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. So let's welcome Indira.
Good morning, or should I say almost good afternoon. First, thank you all so much for having me. Thank you, NCSSS, for inviting me. To my panelists, I feel like I'm in a relay and I'm like the last anchor and I gotta bring it across the finish line. So you all were amazing, so thank you all so much. I wanna start out by saying one of the best decisions I made was to become a social worker. And in my opinion, the social work profession is one of the best professions out there. For me personally, becoming a social worker has enabled me to just take an overhaul of my life. The way in which I engage with my family, my coworkers, my colleagues, the level of self-awareness that we are taught in social work, it is profound. And so I'm gonna talk more about that later on, but I just want to say that, you know, I don't always get it right. And we don't always get it right. And we fall short. But in falling short, we have to be able to acknowledge it. Right? We have to come to a place of acknowledgement, right? And in this very challenging time, I'm in a lot of uncomfortable spaces. I am in the fire just by the nature of my role and what the board of directors have charged me with doing. And I have to do a lot of self-talk and just reflection on, okay, Indira, what's really going on, right? And so I'm gonna talk more about that. But first, I wanna say this is the pep rally, right? This is the pep rally. My fellow panelists and I, we are planting seeds for you all, right? And so hopefully something we say here that you can take back. If this year has taught us anything, it has taught us that the call to action has been extended, right? The rhetoric and the language that is going on in this country, there are no words. And so the call to action has been extended for social workers. Point blank, the call to action has been extended. And so I want to talk to you all about a few things. First, I want to say that all forms of oppression are connected. You can't talk about racial justice without talking about reproductive justice, without talking about LGBTQI justice, without talking about criminal justice. They are all interconnected. You cannot talk about them in silos. I want to kind of order my remarks as follows. One, everyone can be an ally, right? So I want to talk about hard truths of allyship. I want to talk about missteps as an ally. I want to talk about, and then I'm going to talk specifically to my folks of color in the room about allyship. And then I want to talk about the social work responsibility as it relates to the conversation that we're having today. And then I'm gonna give you some final thoughts, if that's okay. Consent is very big in my organization, so I'm always, consent, right? Consent is very big in what I do. So, some hard truths about allyship, right? And this is for everyone, whether you're black, white, or other, this is for everyone. Ally is a noun. I'm sorry, ally is not a noun, it is a verb, right? It is action. It requires a movement, right? That's what a verb is. As my sister before me had said, you know, do not expect to be taught or shown. Take it upon yourself to use the tools available to you to learn about the history of the struggle that you are engaging in. The burden of proof is not on folks of color. It's not on folks of color. We don't take that on, right? And so what I have done in spaces when I have been the fly in the milk, sometimes I won't say anything, right? Because I'm just tired, right? Like emotionally, I'm just tired, right? When Charlottesville happened, all of the executive directors of sexual assault coalitions across the country, the emails were flying. Everybody was doing a statement. And I did a statement to my membership, to my constituencies, to the folks who support the Rape Crisis Center in DC, but I did not send my statement out over the national listserv, and no ED of color did, because we were like, you know what, we really don't have anything to say. But for my clients, right, for my stakeholders, it was important that I say something, right? So I chose to be silent over that national listserv. If you are comfortable in this work, something is missing. We have to be uncomfortable in order to get comfortable, because that is where the real work begins. You have got to be uncomfortable. What I would also say is that you have to listen without defending and speak without offending. Be open to listening. Be aware, as folks have said before me, of your implicit bias. We all have it, right? You have to be in a place to receive things in the right spirit, understanding that everyone has the best intention. You cannot be an ally in isolation. Right? And the reason you can't be an ally in an isolation is because it lacks accountability. It lacks accountability. Allies don't need to be in the spotlight, right? As we've heard, you are supporting the work of those you are allying for. And you are creating a platform for their voice and not yours. You should not be in the forefront. They shouldn't even know you exist, so to speak, right? So those are just some hard truths about allyship. Missteps as an ally. It happens to all of us. Centering yourself. Oh my God, that is not who I am. How could you think that of me, Indira? We hear that all the time, right? But again, I need you to listen without defending. If you have hurt me or harmed me in any way, you can't tell me that you didn't. You can't tell me that you did it. It might not have been your intention, but you can't tell me what I'm feeling, right? Just like if we are seeing individual clients and the client tells the therapist, I'm really upset about what you said. The therapist is not, if they're a good therapist, is not going to say, well, no, that's not true, right? You're gonna have a conversation in a therapeutic setting, right, about what the harm is, right? Okay. Refusing to center the impacted. Refusing to center the impacted. We see a lot of this in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? There's been a lot of controversy around that. Well, all houses catch on fire, Indira. Well, my house is on fire right now. So can you come help me with my house? Right? This is, right? And so we have to be mindful of centering the impacted. That's really, really important. Denying that other people's experiences are different than yours. Denying that the problem is fixable, right? We also have to acknowledge privilege. We all have a level of privilege. We've all seen what has been going on in the media around the hurricanes. It is catastrophic. The country is mourning for what is going on. When Hurricane Irma hit, we saw a lot of media coverage in the beginning around Florida. Well, we were getting emails from our sisters in the Virgin Islands and things like that. We didn't see a lot of media coverage in the beginning around the Virgin Islands, right? What we also have to remember is there was a lot of coverage around folks who are evacuating. Evacuation was a privilege. There was an older African American man who was interviewed by CNN, and he said that he could not evacuate. He's on a fixed income, he just paid rent, he just bought his month of groceries, and he's gonna survive on what is in his cabinet, and some church folks were gonna bring him some gallons of water. Everyone doesn't have the ability to go to the ATM or the bank and get a couple $1,000s out and pack up the car and go across the country, right? So we have to acknowledge our privilege. Victim blaming. Well, why would you show up in Charlottesville understanding what could happen? Victim blaming. Withdrawing is also crucial. Well, I thought you wanted my help, Indira. Well, I guess not, so I'm just gonna go home. Right? That's a problem. And so let me just talk to the folks of color in the room. And Sister Patty started it off so great. So we also, as she mentioned, we have our own work to do. Intra-racial racism is real. Isms is real within communities of color. Our issues around classism, sexism, sexual orientation, and I could not stand up here and not even mention the word historical trauma, right? We have our own work to do. Sometimes my hardest conversations is with people who look like me. It is with people who look like me. Those are the hardest conversations, right? All skin folks are not kin folks. Every sister is not a sister. We don't all look alike and come from similar backgrounds and all of those things, right? And so we have our own work to do. I grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods and went to predominantly white schools, and so my lived experiences are very, very different than some of my fellow African American sisters. And I got a lot of flack for that. I didn't go to a historically black college. I didn't go to Howard University School of Social Work. Why wouldn't you go to Howard? Well, I'm gonna leave that alone, right? Right? I got a lot of flack. Right? I got a lot of flack. And so my hardest conversations is sometimes with folks that look like me. What I will also say to my fellow folks of color in the room, there's been a lot of discord in communities of color around the LGBTQI community. There is so much division within the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex community. It's unreal. I just led a discussion of folks of color, some who identify as LGBTQI, some who identify as cis, which is heterosexual. And we had a hard conversation around, if I am a cis woman, if I am a heterosexual woman, what does that mean in terms of engaging with black trans women? The conversation from cis women to black trans women were, I need you to identify and recognize my womanhood, right? It was a hard conversation. Tears, all kinds of stuff, right? But it was the beginning of something beautiful, right? It was the beginning of something beautiful. What I will also say to, again, the folks of color in the room, some of you may be wondering or saying that NCSSS doesn't do enough around these issues. Well, my challenge to you is this. It is not their responsibility, right? And so I say this, and I say this meaning that it's not their responsibility, but you have a role too. For example, when I was a student at NCSSS, I lived in Dr. Raber's office, in a good way, not in a bad way. I lived in her office. She and I have a wonderful relationship. I was also president of the Master Student Association, and so part of my call to action from my classmates were just bringing different issues to light. And so it's not that you bring them to light, it's about the way in which you do it. It's about process, right? We had conversations, other faculty, Dr. Donaldson, Oliphant, Daltrey, all of them, we talked, right? And so I challenge you, don't operate in silos and really engage in your social work community if you aren't already. Engage with your professors. I learned so much at this school. Learned more than when I came in. And so, but we were also involved. And so I encourage you all, if you're having all these questions, what are you doing about it, right? I like to call it my solution-focused therapy, right? We don't want to be a part of the problem, we want to be a part of the solution, right? So I encourage you to keep that in mind. NCSSS is a great place, and you can learn so much, not just in the classroom, but out of the classroom. But there is a responsibility on you as students. There's a responsibility. in speaking of that responsibility, I want to talk about social work responsibility, right, and best practices. So one of the first things I learned in social work school is every social worker needs a therapist. Every social worker needs a therapist. And so really remember that. As social workers, we don't get to opt out of anti-oppression work, right? We can't. We can't cherry pick parts of the social work profession that are comfortable to us and put the rest on a sabbatical. We can't do that. We want holistic social workers who understand the micro and the macro, right? Who understand that all forms of oppression are connected. It's not just about becoming a clinical social worker. You don't think you're going to deal with these issues in session? Please believe you will. Right? I have clinical social workers who were at other programs, were really good friends. Oh, Indira, how do I become a clinical director? Well, you got to understand some macro. Talk to Dr. Dombo about that. You do. She used to work at our agency. You do, right? That's really, really important. My clinical director now is an NCSSS alum, and I love her because she understands the micro and the macro, right? When I'm having supervision with her, I don't have to deconstruct certain things because she gets it. That's one of the reasons she got hired. Hint, hint. Right? And so we learn about being self-aware we learn about being self-aware in social work school. You have to do the inner work to figure out a way to acknowledge how you participate in oppressive systems. You have to do that work. We also learn about systems in social work, and so you have to do the outer work in order to figure out how to change the oppressive systems. You have to meet people where they are. You have to meet people where they are, and that is really, really important. We have to come together and be able to disarm. Every time I am in a policy meeting or something in the District of Columbia, when I tell you the microaggressions in DC are fierce, the politics are fierce, I go armored up with all of my social work skills, and DC is very elitist in terms of credentials, and God forbid if you're a social worker and not licensed, are you really a social worker? It's unreal, right? And so we have to be mindful of that. What I will also say is that we are the gatekeepers. Social workers, we are the gatekeepers. We get it like no other profession, in my opinion. And so we have to remember that. What I would also encourage you all to do is caucus work. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with caucus work is a key element in anti-oppression work. Folks of color or folks who have similar identities come together to caucus. Whether you are people of color, black people, Latina, same gender loving, white people caucus as well, right? And the purpose of caucus work, anybody can call a caucus. Right now, if I wanted to call a caucus and say, can all the folks of color come over here in the corner and let's caucus? All the white folks, a white person can call a caucus and be like, all the white folks go over there, right? And so the purpose of caucus work is to have a safe space to really begin to deconstruct these issues in an intentional way, to really get to the heart of what's going on. Caucus work is really important. We have caucus at my agency. It's part of our staff meeting once a month. And every staff person has to engage. Because I tell my staff all the time, we don't get a pass just because we're the subject matter experts. Because we all have stuff come up, right? And if we don't get it right internally, we can't get it right externally, right? So that's really important. What I will also say is that when I was at NCSSS, I like to say we were change makers, right, in a good way. We had a great time here. We had a hard time, academically, we had a hard time, a lot of work, right? But we had hard conversations. in our classes, hard conversations where sometimes we had to step outside and take a breath. When I was president of MSA and some of my LGBTQ brothers and sisters who were not out in the social work community wanted to have a solidarity circus right out here, that's what we did. We showed up, right? When we put on the MSW prom and I got text messages asking Indira, can I bring my boyfriend? Can I bring them, right? That's who we are, right? We have to show up for each other. And so what I want to kind of just leave you with is a couple of things. One of the most important things we can do as a human being is to show up. It's to show up when it is uncomfortable to do so. How are you showing up? How are you showing up for yourself? How are you showing up for your classmates? How are you becoming a part of the solution and not the problem? We have to show up unapologetically in this season. One of my favorite authors, Brené Brown, who just came out with a fabulous book, by the way, y'all, she says this: in order to get to courage, we have to walk through the doors of vulnerability. Are you walking through that door? Every day as social workers, we have to get vulnerable. We have to get vulnerable. That's when the real work begins. I have never done so much work on myself until I became a social worker, right? Until I became a social worker, because it is required, right? I cannot be an effective social worker. I can't do this work until I do my own work. And that is so critical. What I will also say is that we are called for a time such as this, you all. We are called. We are called. And so I encourage you all to answer the call in a very intentional way. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to have an anti-oppression card that says you get it. What you do have to do is to be able to walk in the space and say, hey, I don't understand all that's going on here, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to step up and then sometimes step back when I need to, right? That is being a great ally. And what I will also say is that it's scary. This work can be scary. Right? I like to say this is not hard work, this is heart work, right? But it requires that you have to look internally to really ask yourself some hard questions. Where am I stuck in trying to do this work? What in my own past or experiences that's preventing me from moving forward in a very intentional way? Am I scared that I'm gonna sound like a racist? Am I scared that my friends of color aren't gonna wanna be my friends of color? Am I gonna say the wrong things? That's real, right? I get that, that's human, right? But as social workers, you are going to be called to step up in some mighty ways. You're going to be called to step up in some mighty ways, and Asia broke it down beautifully. The nonprofit sector, social workers play a vital, vital role, right? Most nonprofits in DC, they have some hard conversations. Yeah, okay, right? And so again, I just want to say, ask yourself, how are you showing up? Are you walking through the doors of vulnerability? And when you leave this space today, what are your next steps? So thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you all.
Okay. One question for Indira before we get to opening it up, and I'm going to give you a stretch break, not a walking stretch break, a standing in your place stretch break. A question for Indira. Yes, Tony.
You used the word, thank you for sharing.
Sorry?
Thank you for sharing what you're doing. You used the word depression.
I'm sorry, I used the word what?
Hi, you use the word oppression a lot, and I recognize that this is a racism teach-in, and I also recognize that I'm white, and I'm looking at it from a white perspective. And you talked about, you know, not wanting to, I don't want to embarrass myself, right? I want to fit in. But in some ways, racism is probably the ugliest manifestation of oppression that's been going on since the beginning of time. And personally, I find the most difficult part of any kind of dialogue, trying to, you know, develop allies, and is finding everybody's place together in that. And I remember when the Million Women's March was happening, there was a lot of talk about the feminist movement sort of fracturing the different parts of African American women weren't feeling they were being represented in it. And it feels often to me when I watch and observe and learn that, you know, we compartmentalize everything and break it down and pull it apart from an overall view of oppression, that like a broken paradigm.
So what's your question, Tony?
Just, can you elaborate on that? I mean, about the not being fractured by, you know, different perspectives on it, and working together in the same fight.
Well, I mean, just briefly, you know, people are going to bring different perspectives to this work based off of their lived experiences, right? And based off of their own histories and their own traumas. That's expected. That's really where the diversity comes in, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want one perspective or one this or one that, right? So if, you know, when folks bring different perspectives to the work, you know, that's when you really sit down and have conversations, right? And figure out what's the best course of action, right? But different perspectives, let me tell you, they are going to come. That's, you know, that's what this work is about. No one is going to come and agree, you know, have the same kind of thought process. Even us as panelists, we all have different experiences and different thought processes, right? Now, the key is that there are some underlying values that we all hold true in engaging in this work. And so that is our baseline for coming together. And so hopefully, you know, that can kind of be a starting point.
Great. So what I just want, 30 seconds, you all been sitting a while, I know, and there's self-care, right? You need to go out and take care of yourself. You can do that. But why don't we just all stand up for a minute? Stand up. Maybe spread your legs out a little bit to the shoulder length, and reach up to the sky. Oh, stretch out that back and your shoulders. Why don't you bend down, bend over. Stretch out your back. Yeah, okay. Good. All right. So why don't we settle back down in our chairs? We've got 25 minutes of question and answer time. So I think great. We've got people that have microphones that are going to offer them around. And so, who wants to be the brave person to start? Well, I'm going to start with somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. So I'm going to go to Lindsay first, and then I'll move around.
Hi. Is this on? Is it working?
It's on.
Okay.
You have to hold it to your mouth.
Oh, okay. Aja, am I saying that right? Can I ask you a specific question?
No, Lindsay.
I like your personality, by the way. It reminds me of my personality. Anyway, so I really took in what you said about the social work, it looks white. Like, everybody in social work is mainly white. So my question is also thinking about what Eleanor said about white allyship. How, the fact that I'm white and entering into the social work field, isn't that in of itself perpetuating the issue?
Yes.
Okay, but like, what do I do about that? Like, should I not be a social worker?
So it's an excellent question, right? So this question comes up a lot when I actually did a talk for, I think it was Surge, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was Neighborhood Solidarity Network, but it's kind of like the same group of like relatively conscious white folks who, my specialty is the housing crisis and talking about displacement. And they were like, you know, how can we as white people like fight displacement? And I was like, yeah, so step one, stop moving into black neighborhoods. And then they were like, huh, right? But that is one of the first steps. And so I'm not necessarily saying, so don't enter social work. What I am saying is recognizing that it is a very white field, it is the first step. Like recognizing that I am a white woman entering a field that is made up of primarily white women and serving not primarily white women. And there is something to that, means that your responsibility is maybe manifold, right? So it's not just to provide services in a way that is that acknowledges and understands that racial oppression and the history of bias and your own implicit biases, but it is also to undo that, right? Yes. So it is also your work then as a white woman entering the social work field to say, what do I do? How do I use my position and my access here to make it so that, one, I'm allying with like other black social workers who are facing some of the challenges, like, the stigma or the lack of professionalism seen, like if you aren't licensed, right? Which for a lot of black folks, that's true because licensure costs money, and not everyone already has a job that's paying for it. And saying, what are the policies and practices that I can help change? Because people tend to listen to white people tend to listen and sympathize with white women. How do you use that access to broaden access for black folks doing that work? And then actually ultimately figuring out how do white social workers in general work to challenge the systems, right? So moving beyond the very individualistic nature that can be social work sometimes, and saying, what does it mean for me to also take up the challenge to change the systems that make it so that overwhelmingly people who are black are walking through my doors.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I just clarify, so your
advice is to that it's good that I'm recognizing this, and then my next step should be to use my place of privilege to empower the
to
word,
change that reality,
to change the dynamics. Okay, so recognize my power and use it. Is that for good? Yeah.
To use it in the profession.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
that's part of the.
yeah.
I mean, that's what we have to do. You can't just think. You got to change the profession too. Anyhow, I don't want to.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for being here to inspire us and for everything that you do, for your hard work to bring about some changes. So I work for Catholic Charities, and I work mainly with the immigrant population. And so I kind of want to get advice from all of you, if possible, on how I can create more awareness or do more work to help the Latino community, especially right now with everything that's going on with immigration. I want to just raise awareness and educate others about the reality of our immigrant community, that we're not taking advantages of benefits, that we're not taking jobs from anybody, that we're here working hard, and that we're here for a reason. So. I'm sorry, just to clarify, I want to know, so where could I start? Like, what suggestions do you have?
There are a couple of suggestions that I would make. One is there is a group, Justice for Immigrants. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but it's part of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and their building is right across on 4th Street. So they are an organization of, they're Catholic organizations that have come together to really want to provide resources around legislation related to immigration, but also to provide services for those that are being impacted by it. So in other words, they deal with things, they have resource tools, they have resource kits, they also work with clinic which is an organization that provides free legal services for those that are going through the immigration process. And so there are some good resources, there are some good tools that are already on the ground in terms of organizations that are committed to working on this. So if you go online, Justice for Immigrants, part of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, also Clinic. Actually, they go out and they do talks in addition to providing education tools for folks. So, for instance, if ICE shows up at the door, basically letting folks know what they need to do, what are their rights, what they don't have to do. So I hope that's helpful.
Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add on to what Sister Mary said. There's some.
Patty.
Oh, sorry.
That's Sister Ray. Sister Mary Clarence. It's my movie.
Sorry.
That's okay. They say we all look like.
This is what accountability looks like, y'all. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay, man.
There's some additional great organizations as well who are kind of doing work around DACA. Y'all have heard about DACA, right? Mary Center is doing some fabulous work around DACA. There is information on clinics for our immigrant brothers and sisters, as well as the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence and IUDA. All great organizations in DC, and they have real-time, accurate information about kind of how to help your clients. As we just heard, kind of, ICE is showing up in different formats and plain clothes in the courts. So those are some great organizations to tap into.
Go ahead, Naja.
The only other thing I'd add is that so in addition to really good responses that offer resource to individuals who are experiencing discrimination, I think that an organization like Catholic Charities, which I really like a lot of the things that Catholic Charities does, and Catholic Charities has a considerable amount of power, even though because Catholic Charities has a considerable amount of power and sway, but that it's also about nonprofits who have the benefit. So people who work in nonprofits, we get paid to manage the oppression of others, and that's actually regardless of our race. That is just by virtue of being paid and being able to have a job because people are poor. We have a job because things are messed up for a great deal of people, the vast majority of people in this country. And so it's also about using your access to figure out, so what are the laws that are actually making it so that people are experiencing these crises and intervening there. Because the only thing I would say is, and I hope I'm not being presumptuous, but when you were talking, you said we. And so what challenges me about also a person who's a part of a marginalized community is that often education or awareness campaigns turn into us having to prove our humanity. And I just want to affirm for you that actually you don't have to do that for anyone. That you are human and you are worthy, and borders are trash, and that the whole, and police are trash, it's all trash. But that there are all these things that have been set up to really kill us, and I definitely don't want folks of color in this room. I don't want people who are living at the intersections of multiple margins where just existing is traumatic to feel like it is our job to take up the mantle of education and awareness, especially not in this day and age where Google exists. And so, saying hey, here are some resources for you if you want to be a better person. And for people who don't want to be a better person, that I don't want you to ever feel like, and now I have to sit here and prove to you why I deserve to sit here and breathe the same air, because that person is lame. And actually, you don't have to prove anything to them.
That's true. I want to name just for a minute, just a little bit of an ouch moment for a second, because I know that we have people in the room who have friends, relatives, parents, grandparents who are members of the police force, for example. So I think that I think it's clear. I mean, both can be true, right? That you can have a police force that is sort of the arm of oppression and engages in racist behavior and murderous behavior, and there can be some members of the police force also who want to work for change and to do some things differently, right? I just want to put that. I just want to mention.
If I were to actually put a finer point on that, I would offer that there actually is a separation between people who, just like there's a separation between people who are identified as white, or people who gain access to systems who are white, and white supremacy, there is a difference between, I have people who are in the military, I have family, people who I love, dated people, uniforms are kind of hot sometimes, who are police officers. I still am really clear that the militarized state and the way that it impacts means that there are no necessarily like good officers. It doesn't mean that those are not good people. It just means that the police state, and I want to say that because it isn't like, I don't want people to walk away with, I don't want the clarification of my point at least to be that, but there also are good cops. I believe that there are people, that the vast majority of police officers go into that job to actually do good, and I also believe that there must be another way besides what has been shown to be something that is an enforcement arm of a militarized state that continues to kill Black and brown people and continues to kill women.
Yes.
Amen. I think the other piece also is, again, in terms of looking at it from an institutional perspective. Again, we're not necessarily saying that individual persons are bad or whatever, but in terms of the historical understanding of the criminal justice system has not been officer friendly to people of Black and brown hue.
That's right.
And so what has to be looked at is the policies, the practices, and procedures that exist within those institutions, where they have to be looked at, analyzed, broken down, and say, how do we create a justice system that in fact respects and honors the rights of people who are not Caucasian?
Very good.
So I want to, if you don't mind, I also want to jump in on a couple of these things. One is, because I really think historically and big picture, and I really appreciate what both of you just said, and that I'll just add a little bit of my own perspective on that we need a different model than policing. And we need a different model than the police state. And if you look at how and why it was created, it's created to protect private property, and it's created to enforce capitalism. If you look at Standing Rock and what the police did there, they protected the interests of an oil company that can destroy the water of 18 million people. And so it's a problem with the job. Right. And there's certainly good people in those jobs.
Yes. Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to just say, and I don't know that this directly speaks to the last question, but I think it's a framework that we all need to keep in mind, which is one of the pillars of white supremacy and of this country is the takeover of about half of Mexico by war. Sorry. That was just a land grab on the part of the federal government. There's no justification for that at all. And so one of the sayings when I was getting to know like Latinx people in like Chicago, they say, we didn't cross the border crossed us.
That's true.
So this incredible entitlement, there's just this myth of this white nation, and there's just this incredible entitlement that goes with it. And that's one of those things you break down when you actually look at facts as opposed to mythology.
Amen.
That's great. Thank you. I feel like I wasn't looking at the side of the room. Anybody on this side? And I'm going to move back over to this side. How about, go ahead, and then we'll go to you. Okay.
First, I want to say thank you to all for coming. It's been a very informative experience. The one thing that I know that I'm a junior social work major, and one thing that we're always told that I'm always been by professors and my friends that we have to check ourselves at the door. Making sure that our prejudices and our personal beliefs don't interfere with our social work practice. So my question would be is how do we find that balance between knowing what's right for ourselves and then knowing what's right from what we've learned from social justice advocacy and everything, and how we can move forward to be the best version of a social worker?
I mean, I think
good question.
That's a really, really good question, right? And so some might even say that's an ethical dilemma, right? How to kind of own in on your own personal values and balance that with being a good social worker. Well, what I will also say is that as social workers, we have a GPS. And our GPS is our code of ethics, right? Which are being revamped, by the way, for 2018, just a FYI on that. And so our code of ethics, they lay out kind of our principles and our values of being a social worker, right? And so sometimes, again, it's hard, right? Sometimes what I believe personally may be different than how I need to show up as a social worker. right? But if I am working with clients, then it's about the client, right? I am centering the client, right? This is not about Indira. This is not about Indira's values. I have to check my privilege at the door, right? And so what is in the best interest of the client? And really, it's not even for me to decide, right? If we're talking about clients have self-determination. Y'all have heard that before in class, right? Right? And so again, what I would encourage you to do is you can still have your own values and be a good social worker, right? You can still have your own values and be a good social worker if you remember what we are taught, if you remember our principles. You know, someone mentioned earlier the dignity and worth of a person, right? You know, we have a good guide, right? And so this is also why it's good to have great supervision, right? Great supervision in your nonprofits, because this is where you can also bring stuff up in supervision and therapy, right? We're big proponents of therapy, right? So those are just some thoughts off the bat.
Well, Sister Patty wanted to, as a social worker, and then Aja.
Yes, as a social worker, yes. I also would say that there are times when we also need to acknowledge that we are not the best persons to deal with a particular client or a particular situation or a particular case. I mean, we are not superhuman as social workers, and so through supervision and then also through staff sharing, et cetera, it may be the reality that it's too deep for you. It's bringing up transference and counter-transference issues within yourself, and you may simply be not the best person to handle it and to deal with it and to say, I can't, and be okay with that, you know, because we can't, you can't help anybody if you can't help yourself. So and that means your own internal work that's is so needed and necessary and ongoing. It doesn't stop. I mean, I've been 40 years now in social work, and it's still, I have to still keep myself in check. I have to still look at, okay, Patty, is that you? You know, and it's helpful to be able to have other colleagues to be able to come together with and share around these issues, and to realize that, you know, maybe this is a time for referral.
Yeah. Aja, and then there's be a question in the back, and then we'll wrap it up. Then we'll try to fit in, Hope. Go ahead.
The only other quick thing that I would add to that is, so when it comes to, it is about your self-work and also to give yourself grace, right? So I think the reality is, and we never are able to fully check our biases or ourselves at the door, that everywhere we go, every piece of us, all the way up until that very moment, informs our decisions, informs how we feel about safety, informs how we feel about other people, informs our value system. And so I think it is important to also give yourself grace and space to be imperfect and to be like, yeah, you know what, maybe I made the wrong call that time. Doesn't mean I'm a bad social worker, but it is important to notice it. Yes. And I would, in terms of a resource, one that I think is particularly helpful is generative somatics, which is about noticing how your body reacts. And it is an offering for us to be more choiceful. So it's about healing, and it also opens up an avenue for us to be more choiceful. And I'd say this in my supervision a lot, and Terry can attest to it, that that accountability is a gift, and so being intentionally in accountable relationships with other people is really beautiful, and for you to consent to that sort of accountability is really beautiful and really important, and to take in the pieces that are for you when people are giving you critique that can feel hard, and that includes the client. So right there, the client can give you feedback or challenge what you're saying, and it's being open to that imperfection and the fact that maybe you also don't know everything, and it's worth it to notice in yourself, like, what's coming up for me, very similar to what Sister Patty just said. Where is that coming from? And being able to notice. And the more you practice, like the way you practice one thing is the way you do everything. And so the more we practice intentionally noticing, you just get faster at it, you get better at it, and you're able to really give yourself that space, because you're like, you know what, self, this was a mess. We really screwed this one up. But tomorrow's another day, like, you know, there's another client, and I can come back to that person and say, hey, like, I actually recognize that when I was saying XYZ to you, it was coming from this other place, and I want to apologize for that, and I want to talk to you about how we can actually move forward in your care plan or whatever it is that you're offering.
Great advice. Yes.
Yes, I have a few more items that I didn't ask before. One for Sister Patty, knowing thank you and let you know my high school education was through the Sisters of Notre Dame. From a more historical perspective, and the reason that we're all here, I want to know, one, your thoughts on the debate of removing on Confederate statues and renaming things and that. And then for Eleanor, I think my point of my question was, as the director of White Awake, what do you say to a person who makes a statement and then they go, but I'm not racist? My thing is, what do you say to them? But those, you know, you can answer not, but that's my biggest thing for Sister Patty. What are your thoughts on the statue, removing the statues, renaming streets and things like that?
I hear two perspectives, quite honestly. You know, I hear the perspective of they all need to just be taken down because they are racist, etc. Then I also hear, well, perhaps the statue should remain, but there should be a plaque or something else right alongside with it, putting it in historical context, so it could also become a teachable moment and a learning movement and a learning moment. So I've heard both and honestly, I'm not really sure exactly where I am at with it at this particular point. I'm just being straight up and honest with you. There's a part of me that says, yeah, take them down. But then there's also a part that has said, can they be used, you know, or take them down and put them in some museum and people can go there and visit and see it? Or should they remain alongside with something else which would tell the real or the true truth?
Mm-hmm. Eleanor, if you could quickly respond to that.
Sure,
and then
yeah, you know, so, wait, did I turn this off? So yeah, basically, probably what I said is what I would do, but to state it again more from my own perspective, you know, if I don't have a relationship with the person, I mean, basically just call a spade and point out, like, well, no, actually, that is a racist thing that you said, and then you're a matter of communicating, using, I would, you know, use the communication skills that I have and whatever rapport I'm able to develop with them to see how far I can go in explaining and sharing with them why that was just a racist thing that they said. And I guess what I would give as an example is I had someone write into the White Awake Facebook page recently, and she wrote, it was a long kind of like a venting, and it was someone who was white, who was clearly like, her main media source was far right, you know, hatred spewing stuff. And, you know, it was odd, like some of the things she was saying, pretty odd, like there are no white nationalist groups, you know, but there's all of these. And then she used like racial slurs about these people who come out and like attack. And so I was like, wow, you know, so my first instinct was, you know, don't respond and block her. And then I was like, well, you know, I don't know, let me just like interact with this woman. And so I did, and we actually had an incredible exchange where I was sharing information with her. She was coming from fear, like intense fear. And I was like, well, first of all, you know, I don't understand, like, surely you didn't mean what you just said you meant, because that would be like blatantly racist, and you're saying that people aren't racist, so I'm like, so like, what, you know, what'd you mean there? But then I just started sharing with her like the actual facts around what she was talking about and giving her articles. And, you know, I don't know, you know, if she did this or not, but she seemed to be responding very sincerely and saying, I'm gonna read that, I didn't know that. You know, I wanna understand what's happening because I'm really afraid. And it was remarkable the degree to which we had a lengthy exchange, and I shared a lot of resources with her that if she does read them and look at them and watch these videos, she will get a very different perspective than what she's getting, and hopefully she'll change her news source.
Great, thank you. That's a great, concrete response, suggestion. Hope Foster, the last question.
Thank you, appreciate that. Can I turn around?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Not trying to come up here with you guys, but it's for, thank you. So Ms. Indira, you called this the pep rally, and that's what this is. But like when we leave this place and we go out there, and this isn't the pep rally, And you guys have been asking us to be change agents, things that our professors have said to us, and kind of trouble the proverbial social waters. I'm thinking just like, you know, that's different in these systems for black social workers and white social workers. And I think, I'm not sure who brought it up, but like, you know, it's important. I know it was important for me, for my mother, you know, that I made it, that I got my 40 acres and a mule, right? That was important. And like, what am I supposed to do in these non-pep rally situations when I'm working for somebody who doesn't accept what we're talking about, right? Because we're all in here and we're soaking this all up. But what happens when I go out there? I work at a school, and something recently just happened, and I didn't want to challenge the water because I was like, that's my job. And so what do I do, right? Because I want to be true to what we're doing, but our systems don't necessarily allow me to always be true. And sorry, the mic is going out, but I'm just curious, like especially for the people in these systems. I'm sorry to take your mic. These systems who aren't the executives, right? Who aren't at the top, where we're at the not the bottom of the food chain, but like, what do I do? Because I want to be true, you know? That's what I want to do. So I just want to know, like, you know, when we're not working for social workers who believe in this fight, because this is an important fight. Yeah. So if y'all can help me out.
Yeah, so I definitely appreciate that. And what I will say is a couple of things. Safety in doing this work is real, right? And safety for black folks doing this work versus safety that our white sisters, you know, is different, right? And so particularly in nonprofit work, right? As an executive director, staff always worry about safety, right? In terms of if they come to me with something, is that gonna mean their job? Or when I'm writing grants, am I gonna write out their position, right? Hopefully, the folks who are leading, it doesn't work like that, right? I want folks who can come to me openly and authentically, right? And I'm in a place to receive. Because as ED, I don't always get it right. I don't, right? And I try to operate from a place that I'm doing the best that I can in this moment, right? What I would also say in addition to safety, so you have to figure out what your safety looks like in real time. Only you can make that decision. If you don't feel comfortable in your workplace going up the food chain, that's real. And you know, sometimes you may have to operate from a different way, right? There's more than one way to do things in life. What I would also say, you know, as a black social worker is, and just social worker in general, but particularly as a black social worker, self-care is real. I am a big proponent of self-care. What is your container in doing this work? How are you anchored? What is your support systems? Because you may not necessarily get the support that you're needing at your job, right? What do your support systems look like, right? Doing this work and just doing social work, it's a lot, y'all. You know, it is a lot. And so I encourage you in those midnight hours when you are not at the pep rally, when you are not in class, when you are in your apartment or what have you, where do you turn to, right, in the midnight hour? What is your support system? And that is gonna be important because it's gonna help you sustain in doing this work. Self-care is ever evolving, right? But because of these challenging times, things are so volatile, and it's important that we take care of our heart. It's important that we take care of our heart.
Okay. And if I could just add to that also, and that is, I can't help but reiterate the importance of self-care. Mm-hmm. But the other thing too is you got to be able to live with you. And so there may be times in which you may have to, through discernment, to say, it's time for me to shake the dust from my feet here and to move on and to move on to someplace else. Now you might have to eat some beans and rice while you're in that interim, but the fact of the matter is you have to be able to live with yourself. And if you know that there is injustice within systems that are taking place, you may have to say, there's nothing I can do about this, because there are times we simply cannot do anything, even those of us who are gatekeepers. And I happen to be a gatekeeper. But when it gets to a point where it's against my value system and against everything I believe in terms of the maximum potential of people, et cetera, then it's time for me to think about moving on.
And it's also a really good place for white social workers, or like white folks at your job, period, even if they're not social workers, to step in and step up. Yes. That you can have, you probably have, there's probably some white person there who probably done been to a surge meeting who not only has a framework and an understanding that something is wrong, but also has a framework for why it's important for that person to step up. And if they don't, now you have some resources to offer to like a white ally who in that moment may feel paralyzed, right? Or may feel like this is a thing that's messed up and I'm not sure what my point of entry is, or I'm not sure what I can do. You now have an opportunity to be like, hey, actually went to this thing, and here are some resources that talk about how you can show up as a white ally, because it's one of those things where white folks can have a very different conversation about racist things that happen within white systems than a black person can have, and that you shouldn't, like everyone said, like take on that trauma. And it doesn't mean you're not down just because you do what is safe for you. And if there are black folks who say that to you, you can also challenge them to show up, right? Because what Black Alliance looks like. So me, girl, I'll turn up anywhere. I have people who call me and they're like, this is happening in my job. I'm like, do you want me to come? Because one, I always text my CEO first, and I'm like, so this is what I'm finna do. And then, I go turn up because I am blessed to have like a black CEO who's like, friend of projects in Norfolk, who like understands why sometimes I need to get down, who supports my decisions to show up in that way. And because that is my privilege, it is a privilege. I take that responsibility. If there are people who are saying, yeah, you're not this and you're not that, and they look like you and I, challenge them to show up. Okay, cool, show me what to do then. You got it, you got the answers, right? Come show me.
Okay. Indira, one last comment.
Lastly, what I would say is most nonprofits hopefully have a system of policies in place. That's right. Where staff can, challenge the status quo, right? So for example, if I do something as an ED that doesn't sit well with my staff, we have a whistleblower policy, right, where there won't be repercussions. Folks can reach out to my board chair, right, all anonymously and all of that, and there won't be repercussions. So each agency kind of, has their own policy, but normally nonprofits have things in place where you can really bring it to the higher ups and it won't clap back on you, right? What I will also say is, challenging injustice is part of what we do, right? And if we don't stand for something, we will fall for anything. And so what I am seeing in the DC community is that, social workers are standing up, right? They're showing up in policy, they're, showing up in other systems, right? Because what they're saying is this does not sit with our values.
Yeah, that's great. So, in a minute, we're going to move to lunch, but we're going to start promptly again at 1:30 in our groups. We're going to stay at these tables and keep the conversation going. We're going to keep talking about this until 2:45. Before you go, we've just had a marvelous panel. I hope you were made uncomfortable. I hope that you were excited, so thank you. Thank you. It's awesome. Really awesome. Okay.